Our similarities bring us to a common ground, but it's our differences that allow us to be fascinated by each other. However, in this episode, we're going to dive into the problems that our ego gives us by this fascination in our differences, and how the fascination can lead us to jump to wildly negative and unhelpful conclusions that actually just completely blind ourselves from reality of what's going on in the world. Hello and welcome to the Growth Mindset podcast, diving into the psychology of self-improvement, again with your host, Sam Webster Harris. I'm very much looking forward to Christmas. Now, you have probably heard about the 80-20 rule and the many ways that it comes up. Also in psychology, we often hear that we focus 5 times more on things that are negative than we do on things that are positive. For example, if it comes to money, we'll go 5 times more out of our way to avoid a loss than we'll go out of our way to create a similar amount of gain. However, when it comes to our ego and our desire to be unique, I think this is even worse. I think it's actually more like a ratio of 99 times to 1. We innately focus on the differences all around us and we miss the similarities and the parallels to our own situation. And the reason I want to talk about this at Christmas is because it's a time for love. It's a time for compassion and being kind and loving our fellow humans. And I think when we realize how similar we are instead of obsessing on the differences, we become much nicer people to everybody around us. And I think a lot of the problems in the world and the troubles that we cause ourselves are often caused by amplifying the differences and coming to silly conclusions about them. But as I've been requested to lately, I'm going to do a bit of a longer, deeper dive episode, and I've got some great analogies to kick off with that I'm quite excited about. If you haven't been listening for long, I actually studied biology when I was a student, and I've also done computer programming and of course spent time studying psychology. So this first example was something that I just found quite interesting. But whether or not you've heard about this, people are often quite confused by the fact that humans and chimpanzees have 99% identical DNA. Now, chimpanzees live in forests and trees. They can't speak, they aren't capable of forming intellectual societies, and generally speaking are wildly different to us. And it seems that 99% identical is just a bonkers concept to wrap your head around. But that's just a failure to look at the bigger picture. Imagine you had to write a computer program to turn inanimate chemicals into life, and you could do whatever you wanted to create a chimp from these inanimate chemicals and a human. Well, I bet that you'd end up with 99% identical code, because firstly, to create life, you need to create a system that will release energy from some easily accessible chemical store of energy. So you're going to spend a huge amount of time building something like a mitochondria that will turn glucose and oxygen into carbon dioxide and water whilst releasing energy. Now, the mitochondria is an amazingly wildly successful little piece of machinery, but it's a lot of faff to design from scratch. And so once you've managed to code one, you're just going to copy paste the same code into pretty much all multicellular organisms that exist, because that's what nature did. And to be fair, being lazy and being efficient are two sides of the same coin. So now you're able to release energy and have life, you're going to need things like bones, hair, eyes, teeth, skin, nails, things that work together like a respiratory system, a nervous system, a digestive system, an immune system, a way to pump all of the different stuff around the body in a circulatory system. And finally, you'll need a way to heat the body, an excretion mechanism to handle waste, and of course, the most important part, reproduction. Well, again, all of these different elements, they're a lot of work. So you're basically just going to do each one once, copy paste all of your code, and just change like a few input variables for the size or thickness of things like hair or specific dimensions of a bone, etc. And you basically just used all the same stuff. The result is a code base that is 99% identical, but one is a chimp that swings in trees with thicker hair and hand-like feet. The other is a human which runs on the plains, has bigger brain, opposable thumbs, and much less hair. All of those differences between chimpanzees and humans is just a few simple changes in a few input variable sizes of the different building blocks. And so the reason I've said this is that so much of the reality of the world around us is hidden from us, whilst it's there in plain sight. It's hidden from us due to the fact that it's our intuition to focus on differences instead of similarities. So I'm going to give you a more relatable example to like the human psychology. Imagine you asked a resident of New York or a resident of London about the two cities and their differences. Now, they will talk your arm off about the incredible differences between the comedy, the music, the mindset, and oh man, just the society, the accents, the cab drivers, the pizza, and just the somewhat indescribable atmosphere within the city. And trying to compare such different cities like New York or London it's like apples and pears. Imagine you zoom out a little bit and compare some other megacities like perhaps the overpopulated slums of Dhaka, Bangladesh, where there's rubbish all over the streets and the worst pollution on the planet, or perhaps the insanity of Tokyo, Japan. Looking at those cities, you would experience major levels of differences in society, values, architecture, comedy, and music. And not only is the accent different, but the language has no similarity at all. And don't get me started on the many ways that they can murder a pizza. However, there still are some similarities, like they are both the capital cities of the nation, and they attract more and more individuals to go and build their career there, and they're one of the few megacities in the world. So how about we zoom out a little bit further and compare New York or London to perhaps the nomadic herders of Mongolia, or a village in the mountains of Patagonia, or perhaps trying to live in the tiny manned outpost that exists on Antarctica. Now that we reflect on it, New York and London are pretty much two of the most similar locations on the entire planet. If you ask someone who grew up in a slum in the third world to spot the differences between the opportunities or culture between New York and London, they will see high-paying jobs, luxurious and stupidly expensive apartments, and a complete inability for anybody on public transport to acknowledge the other human beings around them. I think it's just so fascinating that when we jump into these things, we're like, oh, these two cities are so different. But as soon as you start to zoom out and look at all the dimensions of possibility in the pure reality of the situation, New York and London are 99% identical in the context of the planet. Now, you're probably getting the gist of where I'm going with the fact that humans are obsessed with differences when there are so many similarities, but I have another example to bring it even closer to home, and I think it's really worth going this one stage further. Now, if you ask anyone who has siblings about their brother or their sister, they will tell you about how perhaps wonderful or idiotic that sibling is, but they'll also, more importantly, explain how different they are. And it's also the same for parents of kids. They're always going on about how crazy different it is that this one likes carrots, but this one likes chicken, and this one doesn't talk very much, etc. And it was the same for me. My sister, she's really artier than me. She's very talkative and social. I'm much better at maths and physics, very happy in my own silent company, and I'm just quite a quiet person. My sister is content to have a glass of wine and some cake, whereas I prefer a long run and a protein bar. My sister can be perhaps a bit more emotional about things, which I often don't feel emotional about and don't cry in movies, etc. We look kind of different. She has like paler skin, and of course, she is a woman. However, in the eyes of someone else, we have pretty much the exact same hair. For anyone watching YouTube, you can see this is a drawing of me and my sister not very long ago. A drawing of me and my sister when we were fucking 8. Anyway, we have the same hair, the same teeth, the same eyes, the same legs. We are very clearly related. People sometimes ask if we are twins. We share the same music tastes and mannerisms. Despite her strengths in art and talking, she actually went into project management for energy companies, and she was very good at it. And that's the kind of thing that you would have thought I would have done. And despite the fact that I am a physics geek, I now run a podcast talking about psychology and emotions. It's doing quite well, relatively speaking. We're in the top 0.5% of podcasts. Thanks, guys and girls, for listening. When me or my sister are presented with a restaurant menu, we could take a very long time to decide, and we'll usually still panic at the last moment and choose something we don't even want because someone else has ordered the thing that we were going to order, and we're like, ooh, can't all be getting the same thing. I don't know why we do that. Anyway, despite knowing full well when we need to be ready for something like an important meeting or leaving to get a plane, etc., we'll have a very good knack of somehow being ready about 10 minutes late. We both hate and overthink things like email. We have very similar tastes in politics and food, and what is fundamentally right and wrong. We can both get a bit embarrassed when talking about sex, and other similarities is we both have a similar attitude to money. When eating, we both diligently scrape the remains of our plate or a yogurt pot until it's pretty much spotlessly clean, much to her husband's annoyance. And in fact, when her husband spent time with my whole family over lockdown, he realized that some of the afflictions my sister has is actually something that my whole family does and not just her, which was nice for him to realize, if not slightly worrying. Anyway, I have definitely met some people in the world who, in specific domains like perhaps exercise or entrepreneurship, are more similar to me than my sister. But actually, if you were to measure all domains of a human in total, my sister is easily the most similar human to me on the planet. Yet, usually all we do is talk about our differences, and all my mum can tell you about is how wildly different we are. And I think the same can be said for many brothers and sisters around the world. Yet these are people we just spend so much time finding and pointing out our differences instead of looking for our similarities. So I think I spent enough time now giving some context to the more important part of the podcast, which I'm going into. But I think it was really worth laying down the fact that humans will look at this tiny small 1% difference that we have in a scenario, and we'll think that this is like a really huge important thing, and we'll be completely blind to how much similarity there is around us. And although the examples that I've just given were all fairly harmless, but perhaps curious things to recognize, I think these are representations of some of the worst predispositions that humans have, such as sexism, racism, just general tribal behavior. Like, look at politics today. It's so divisive. We'll look at someone with a different opinion to us, and we see people who we think intentionally want to cause the rest of us problems. We see people who want to screw up our country or even screw up the world for their own corrupt desire for gain or chaos. What we don't see is how they were brought up or their personal situation. We don't see why their views make sense, probably based on their experiences. We don't see how they have some of the same fundamental needs and desires as we do. We, of course, obsess over the differences, and we explain those differences due to the fact that these people are just worse people than us. We assume that they are less intelligent, we assume they are greedy, and we assume that they are probably intentionally terrible, evil people. We'll spot a few differences, and we'll create a bunch of fictional differences in our heads, which makes us hate them even more. We completely neglect the fact that we are so much more similar to any person that has a different political view to us than we are different. We forget that we are all humans who deserve love, who deserve kindness and opportunities, and who, by and large, are a result of the environment that we live in. We quickly blame the person instead of their situation. We are really blind to how we would probably make the same choices in the same situation. And we think that somehow we're much better people that would be behaving very differently and much better than them. We should first seek to find the similarities in the people we judge. Yet instead we focus on those differences. And when we focus on those differences and we assume that they're due to some form of corrupt or evil nature, we'll start to assume that the people who are like us are much better, and that's very tribal thinking. We really don't see that we might do something very similar in the same situation. We don't think about how we can find common ground and work on long-term solutions that would build trust and love and kindness, and we instead erect barriers between us by blaming them even more for their situation. So if we look at history, it's easy to look at the Nazis and think that we would never follow such an unspeakably cruel or terrible cause. Yet, if you lived in Germany through the First World War, and you lost everything, and then you spent the 1920s and 1930s in a nation that was just being crippled by debt to the rest of Europe and America, and if you had no hope over multiple decades of ever having a good life, you would probably have a different mentality. When there is no hope for you or for your children to make money or be able to afford basic things, when someone comes and tells you that it isn't your fault, When someone comes and offers you hope, when someone offers you a belief that you can follow that could build a stronger country, when someone for the first time in 20 bloody years is prepared to rip up all the confinements that keep you in your destitution, it's an incredible source of hope. And hope is so important when people are feeling that low. And you could just look at Argentina at the moment. The love for the new president, Milei, who is prepared to buck the trend and rip up the policies of the Argentinian government and give the nation finally some hope that they might be able to get back on their feet again, or at least have some change. The truth is that if we're in Argentina today, despite some of the weird far-right policies that Milei represents, that perhaps don't represent our own personal views, we might still vote for him, like many of my own friends who are Argentinian and my age have done, because we'd be more interested in the potential of a brighter future than we would about some of the policies that are a bit weird. And if we were in Germany in the 1930s, we would likely be looking to Hitler for hope as an end to our situation. He got into power through the majority of the nation voting for him. And only by looking at people who made decisions that we think maybe were wrong and trying to have compassion and empathy to understand that decision can we start to create a way of preventing the problems that those decisions cause. Because instead of looking at the actions of the German people and punishing them again after World War II in the same way that we did after World War I, we instead looked at their needs. Ultimately, the Germans are just people, and they needed to be in a nation that had potential for economic opportunities. They needed the ability to put food on their table, and they needed the security of the potential for their children to be educated and move on to a brighter future and have good jobs. If we had punished the Germans after World War II in the same way, we may well have just created more pent-up problems for the future, but instead we accepted that people are less different than we think and they need treating with kindness and compassion as opposed to cruelty. Of course, we removed the war criminals and the Nazi leaders from German society, but the nation itself was not punished in the same way and it was allowed to grow because the German people are ultimately just people who deserve the ability to make a good life. And when they were able to, they actually showed that they are lovely, helpful people who are bloody great to have in Europe. And that's why it's important to learn about compassion and empathy instead of being tribal and blaming people for everything. And whilst we're talking about that, it's important to note that due to our obsession with our differences, I think that's a major factor in what makes humans racist. When we look at racism, it is an egocentric bias towards our own greatness and others' idiocy or evil nature. The obsession with differences as opposed to compassion to look for similarities fuels so many of our prejudices, and it is the cause of so much hate and conflict on the planet. We fail to recognize how many of the decisions of other cultures or our enemies would be the same if we were in their place. We have this obsession with differences, and we explain those differences as a fundamental part of the fact of why these people are worse than us in some way, instead of thinking that maybe we would have some of those differences ourselves if we were in the same position. I mean, even today you can look at Israeli and Palestinian citizens, and the way many of them can see each other is only through the injustices caused to their own people, and they prescribe that down to some evil nature of the other party. It's very hard for them to recognize their own desire for freedom and safety, and that the violence that they're committing within their own society fuels this, and to stop blaming the other side. Now, I certainly agree that the Palestinian side is taking an unfair level of killing and oppression, and it's bloody terrible. For context, I actually did live in Israel for a while, where I was working with the Arab community in Nazareth, teaching them to code to give them opportunities because they have a terrible apartheid there. And I have been into the West Bank a few times, and I totally don't agree with the Israeli occupation. However, I also totally don't agree, and I also don't agree at all with how the Israeli army has bombarded so harshly Gaza or the general occupation of West Bank. However, I also think that many people in the West who have largely ignored Gaza for so long have now only grown compassion for the Palestinian side without any compassion for the Israeli problems. If America, say, or the UK had been attacked in a similar way with over 1,000 of our own civilians brutally murdered, raped, or mutilated by an organization that believe that they will personally achieve the highest form of enlightenment to our complete destruction as a people, we might not be calling for an end to a ceasefire, and we might feel a bit insecure ourselves that these people are out there. Now, I would certainly love to believe that if America or the UK was implementing a war on Hamas, that we would find ways to be more sensitive to civilians. I would love to believe that, but I would also wonder if we really want many, many more of our sons, our friends, our husbands, our fathers to be killed fighting that enemy whilst using tactics that made it easier for more of their civilians to survive. Because saving the people we know versus more people who we don't know is not a natural thing for humans to do. It's certainly the right thing to do, but it's not a natural thing to do. So I think you can have empathy for the decisions that people make on both sides of this conflict, even if they are making terrible decisions on both sides of the conflict. And I don't think that they really are doing the right thing at all. Anyway, before this gets too political, my point here is that besides the extremists within both sides of the populations, the majority of people in them hold beliefs that are completely understandable, and we should have compassion for their actions and assume that we might be doing something very similar, as opposed to blaming all these sides and shouting terrible things about people or becoming racist. Racism and war has been a part of human history since the dawn of civilization, but the cost is just so incredibly high, and it just does not benefit our global population or species, and it doesn't seem like a behavior of a species that defines itself as intelligent and caring and loving. How many alien movies or robot movies did the humans win because they are able to love, etc.? And yet, suddenly we do all these things and it just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, by developing our compassion and recognizing our similarities, we can behave with more wisdom, and we can create solutions based on trust rather than acting out of fear. And now, as I get some closure on one hot topic, I'm just going to jump deeply into another hot topic that's also very important. And you can see some similar issues with sexism and patriarchy and the whole obsession with our differences without recognizing how similar we are. Because, yeah, sexism, patriarchy, absolutely terrible things, cause loads of problems. Sure, men and women do have many differences, but actually, I would say 99% of our needs, wants, desires, skills, abilities are the same. It's so easy to focus on our differences that we neglect how fundamentally similar we are in the big picture. We do both deserve equal opportunities. We do both deserve respect. I think we all know how absurd it was for men to think that women shouldn't have the vote or shouldn't have jobs. And sure, women do have some different interests. They do have some different skills, but they're clearly just as capable as excelling in science, business, and politics, and they're even pretty damn good at sports. I think it's just pretty clear to see how unhelpful it was that in the past we focused on the differences between men and women and how unfair that was towards women. We, of course, aren't exactly the same, but even things like the fact that the average woman is smaller and is weaker than the average man doesn't mean that we should assume it for every single individual case. Now, I work out a lot. I run ultra marathons, I can squat twice my body weight, I do loads of pull-ups, and I am genuinely one of the fittest men that I know. However, in every single individual sport that there are women out there who can beat me. So by focusing on our differences and just assuming that we know that someone is worse than us is really stupid, because you just don't know. And looking at the history of sexism and patriarchy, we can see how focusing on our differences was so unhelpful in the past. But what about our current times and our future? I would describe myself as a feminist, and that I believe men and women should be treated equally, and I honestly believe that women are actually better, slightly perhaps, at some things than men. However, I was listening to one of my favorite women out there the other day when she said something I wasn't so sure about. For context, she is a very successful businesswoman who I largely agree with on everything, and she's a source of good information for me. And she's done a lot to help the climate and generally improve entrepreneurship opportunities for women. So all causes that I care about. She was talking about some of the issues with climate and was saying how the fact that oil companies have been run by men is one of the problems that cause climate change. And if there were more women on the board, these women would probably be more concerned about the world because they care about the future that the children will grow up in, and they care about the world they want to leave behind. They're better at being more conservative with money and being less greedy and not taking so much, and they're just generally more responsible people. And I was like, yes, preach to me. Men are such idiots. Women really are the greater half of our race. But then I was like, wait, I'm being sexist. And if I think about all the things that I've literally just said earlier about how it's so easy to amplify our differences and miss the 99% of ways that we are similar, then perhaps I might be wrong, and perhaps so is she. Because is it really the act of being a man that made these people contribute to climate change, or is it their circumstances? If a woman chose to work at an oil and gas firm for over 20 years, would she be someone who's focused on the environment, or would she actually believe that climate change doesn't exist? Probably believes climate change isn't the problem and is happy to earn money from being in the oil and gas industry. And to be fair, I do know some women who don't believe that climate change exists. And let's say this woman got promoted onto the board of an oil and gas firm where her priority was to make money for the firm, and by making money she'd be able to keep her job. Would she really stop the company from operating in the same way other oil companies do and try to turn it into some planet-loving entity, even though she'd probably lose her job instantly and never get to do any of the things she wanted for the company anyway? Well, actually, it seems pretty unlikely that a woman would have behaved differently, given that the type of woman that would even go for that job and then the pressure of the job would push someone to take similar actions as the man leading it did. So perhaps it's not the act of being a man as such as the act of being a boss in the oil industry that made people make these decisions. Sure, most women that I know would behave way more responsibly given that power. But then, so would most of my millennial friends who are male, because my generation just care about the environment more. I certainly wouldn't say that men didn't cause climate change, because men were the ones who were running the oil companies and were mostly the ones as political leaders. But is it the act of being a man that made them do it? That I'm not so sure about. In the same way that men in politics allowed climate change to happen, it isn't the act of being a man as such as being the act of someone in politics. We had Margaret Thatcher ruling the country for a long time, and she didn't especially change anything to make the environment better. And then even this year we had Liz Truss as our Prime Minister for like a week, who was so irresponsible with money that she ruined the economy, and she had to be replaced almost instantly to solve the crisis. We also had Suella Braverman as our Home Secretary, who was so racist that she's been trying to send all refugees directly to Uganda, despite the fact that her own family were immigrants. We've also had the recent scandal of Baroness Michelle Mone, who profited $60 million from government contracts for COVID PPE, and she used all that money to buy herself a yacht. So it isn't the act of being a woman that concretely makes you financially responsible or more loving and caring to your fellow humans and never greedy. There are definitely women who abuse their power, and some of the types of women that go into politics aren't great, just as some of the types of men who go into politics aren't great people. And there are definitely women who would make just as bad decisions as the men that have been running oil companies have. And probably the only women that would have reached being on the board of an oil company would have been the types of women that probably wouldn't have behaved any better. And when you look at the men that were running those oil companies, they are the few men that don't care about the planet at all, and they don't represent all men. Like, on the podcast, I've had Dr. Nar McCann. He started the National Park Rescue Charity, who have, I think 20 national parks now across Africa, preserving rainforests, preventing poaching, and protecting endangered species. I've also had Jim Mann on the podcast, the founder of Undo, which is a company on target to remove an entire gigaton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. A gigaton is 1,000 million tons of carbon. So it's certainly not like there aren't any men on the planet who care about the planet and the species on it. The reason I'm saying this is that, it's so easy to think in terms of differences, and this predisposes us for sneaky sexist or racist ideas to slip into our ways of thinking. When I heard that lady saying that men caused climate change, and if women were in control, we wouldn't have this situation, I was like, hell bloody yes, men are idiots. But then that was comparing just the average woman against the few worst men that caused the problems, and it's also ignoring all the ways that we are similar. So in summary, it's very important to assume men and women are the same, otherwise we can lead ourselves down sexist beliefs that simply aren't true and make us dislike and disrespect the other gender unfairly. And that can be sexist in both directions, men towards women or women towards men. And it makes the whole thing more tribal and unhelpful. I think it's very understandable for women today to feel the weight of patriarchy because it is a very big weight and it's a terrible thing to deal with. I definitely want to help make the world a more equal place. But from a mindset perspective, I also think some women perceive more problems than there are by focusing on our differences and developing the expectation that most men are more intentionally evil and problematic than they are, when it's often not the act of being a man rather than just a human in that given situation where a woman might also do something very similar. I'm really trying to tread carefully here, because I certainly don't want to down talk to women or make it sound like I think everything is fine for women now, or like men have never done anything wrong, because they have, and it isn't all fine for women now. And certainly my friends who've been getting pregnant are just missing job opportunities compared to my guy friends who are working. There are lots of other things still to fight for, but it's important to also recognize where you're fighting things that are just in your head without checking reality. If you have an image of men in your head that's actually only represented by a few weirdos on the far end of the distribution curve who are idiots, and you compare those idiotic men against just the average woman who are of course lovely, you're going to feel like you're in battle of these lovely people against these terrible people. But if you remember that as humans we obsess over differences instead of focusing on the many ways that we are so similar, it's easier to think with a wider worldview and think about more practical and better solutions to these problems. I also think that it's quite interesting that despite most religions being thousands of years old, if you look at the Ten Commandments or all the rules of Buddhism, they still apply to you exactly the same whether you're a man or a woman. The path to inner peace is following the same fundamental things by following compassion, following loving kindness, seeking to understand those that act in ways that you don't agree with, instead of trying to punish them. So I thought I'd talk about this at Christmas because as we come towards Christmas, we'll often see old family members, old friends, we might be revisiting traumas from our past, and it's a time for celebration, it's a time for love, and it's a time for kindness. It's easy to go through our life thinking that all the acts that people do that we don't like, those acts were intentional, and that those people deserve blame for being such a terrible person compared to ourselves. And yet we're often so blind to the many other things that people might be dealing with, and we'll take their bad acts at surface value, and we'll start blaming them instead of trying to build compassion for them or seeking why they might be having problems, and that things actually have much less to do with us than we think. So I really, really want to encourage you to just look for the similarities in those people around you this season, or in your opposite gender or other races that you might be in contact with. Whether you have a grumpy checkout dude at the counter, or a very annoying cousin, or perhaps your ex-wife is around. I don't know. Ultimately, as a species, humans aren't actually that amazing. We don't make the best decisions. We respond terribly to stress around us, and we find it so easy to blame others. So instead of letting yourself do that, try to share some love this season. Try to build compassion. Try to recognize the similarities between you that will always exist, and try to bring the people around you up instead of them taking you down or you taking them down. And thank you so much for listening. I can't wait for next year. It's going to be such a good year. I am going full time on this podcast and going to be delivering lots more mindset wisdom. If you have any questions for me, do please email growthmindsetpodcast@gmail.com, or of course, drop a comment on Spotify or YouTube. Good ratings are very much appreciated. If you felt like you learned something about the world and suddenly realized how different the world is to the way we just naturally perceive it, of our obsession on all the differences as opposed to just how similar everything is, then I'd love to know. If you think I'm a right idiot who is racist and sexist, then I've really tried to help people here and hope that came across as opposed to coming across full of bigotry. Ironically, the people that think that are probably the people that most needed to hear this, but that's life. But yes, do please drop me a good review if you can. It's Christmas, so that would be an epic Christmas present for me and the podcast. And yes, as I've said a million times in this episode already, be bloody kind to the people around you and try to build your compassion. And as I always say, life is to be enjoyed. It's Christmas. Then if you're not enjoying yourself now, try not to put it off for some future Christmas or some other weird arbitrary measure that you have before you're allowed to be happy. Life's pretty short. You need to start working on these things. It's very important. Easy to say, but it is really important. So good luck and have a very, very Merry Christmas.